जहां रहेगा वही रोशनी लौटाएगा, किसी चिराग का अपना मकान नहीं होता। नमस्कार। We have gathered today to pay homage to late Dr. Justice Kati Kitala Ramaswamy ji through the annual lecture series starting from today. On this occasion, I welcome our chief guest, the Honorable Attorney General of India, Shri K.K. Venugopal ji, who has joined us on the online mode. Padam Vibhushan Shri K.K. Venugopal ji is an Indian constitutional lawyer and a senior advocate in the Honorable Supreme Court of India. He is presently serving as the Attorney General of India since 2017. Shri Venugopal is a well-known jurist of international repute and was appointed by the government of Bhutan to serve as a constitutional advisor for drafting the constitution of Bhutan. We are also joined today by respected Shri Chaman Lalji, who is an IPS officer, retired. Shri Chaman Lalji was born in Abbottabad, now in Pakistan, on 10 September 1938. He did his education in Dehradun and was topper in his class. After retirement, Shri Chaman Lalji also served as in the honorary capacity as a special rapporteur of the National Human Rights Commission. He was IGP in charge of the Operation Black Thunder at the Gondal Temple, the director of the BSF Academy, and Additional Director General of the Border Security Force and the DGP of Nagaland. Shri Chaman Lalji is the recipient of the President's Police Medal, and Padam Shri has been awarded to him. I also welcome our very own respected director, sir, respected Shri Sanjeev Chopra ji. We all know him. He's a scholar par excellence and an excellent orator, an IAS officer of the 1985 batch of the West Bengal cadre. Sir has served in various capacities and is presently the director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. We are indeed privileged to having been joined by respected Shri Srinivas Ramaswamy Kati Kitala ji, who is an IAS officer of the 1989 batch of the Indian Administrative Service. Sir is presently serving as the Establishment Officer and Additional Secretary in Department of Personnel and Training, Government of India, the highest post for human resource management in the Government of India. Sir has done his LLB and later LLM. Sir has served in various capacities in the government of Gujarat as well as government of India, right from general administration, urban development, industries department, the panchayats department, housing and urban development department. I welcome you, sir. And sir happens to be a scion of the Kati Kitala family. We are indeed privileged to have you here, sir. Justice K. Ramaswamy ji rose from great hardships in life and excelled in academics at a very young age. He became a practicing lawyer, a government leader, and was elevated as a judge of the Honorable High Court of Andhra Pradesh. After a successful tenure as a judge of Andhra Pradesh High Court, he became a judge of the Honorable Supreme Court of India in 1989. He was known for his compassion towards the marginalized, and most popular them amongst being his magnum opus, the Samtha judgment, establishing rights of the tribal communities on their lands. I also welcome the respected dignitaries, the faculty members, and my fellow OTs and my colleagues to today's memorial lecture. May I request Worthy Director, sir, Shri Chaman Lalji, Shri Srinivas Ramaswamy Kati Kitala ji, to pay 4 tributes to the departed soul. Oh, thank you. May I now request respected Dr. Sanjeev Chopra ji to introduce the concept of memorial lectures and its relevance to the courses at the Academy. Sir.
Thank you, Lalit. Honorable Attorney General of India, Shri K.K. Venugopal ji, who has very kindly consented to deliver the first Justice Katikala Memorial Lecture, albeit online at the Academy. Shri Chamanlal ji, a very distinguished police officer and a very distinguished civil servant and a person who has deep commitment for human rights. It's an honor and a privilege for us that you are back at your alma mater and you will be the main discussant today. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation. We're delighted that Shri Srinivas Katikala and his family members, Bindu and Mr. Joshi, Mr. and Mrs. Joshi, they're all here with us today. Professor Makarand Paranjpai, who's somewhere here, hiding in the corner, Shri Manish Sabharwal, Shri Ravi Kailas, Pankaj Joshi, members of the Academic Council, officers of Phase 3 and Phase 1, officers from the CTIs and ATIs who are participating in this online, officers of the DOPT and other government organizations who are with us online. It's a pleasure for me to deliver the opening remarks on this very august occasion, where we will not only talk about this lecture in such, because this lecture will be delivered by none else than Mr. Venugopal, and the theme we know is on administrative discretion and judicial review. But what I will do is I'll set the context for memorial lectures. Why do we organize memorial lectures? What is the tradition of memorial lectures in the Indian and the Occidental civilizations? But before that, I think it's very important to set in context the life and the works of Justice Katikala. Lalit just mentioned about the seminal judgments in which the tribals got access to their lands. But I would also like to quote two of his statements on secularism and on gender equality. Secularism because it is the leitmotif of India, and it is the foundation of our constitution and of how we organize ourselves. And gender equality because we are soon going to be celebrating the International Women's Day on the 8th of March. So to quote Justice Katikala, secularism is a part of the basic feature of our constitution. Political parties, groups of persons, or individuals who would seek to influence electoral processes with a view to come to political power should abide by the Constitution and the laws, including secularism, sovereignty, integrity of the nation. Programs or principles of political parties based on religion amounts to recognizing religion as a part of political governance, which the Constitution expressly prohibits. So this is a very clear message and a clear learning to all of us. And as yesterday, the Honorable Tribal Affairs Minister was saying, that the elected representatives have a role, and we who are selected by the UPSC, we also have a role. And together, the elected and the selected will make the Indian democracy run. And he quotes that if religion is made a part of the political process, then it violates the basic feature of the Constitution. Positive secularism negates such a policy, and any action in furtherance thereof would be violative of the basic feature and structure of the Indian Constitution. This is Justice Katikala. And on gender equality, he says that when a male member has a right to seek partition, and at his behest, fragmentation of family holding is effected, why not the right of inheritance and succession be given to a female? On agnetic theory, she gets a shadow, but not the substance. The right to equality and social justice is an illusion, and the denial is absolutely inconsistent with public policy, unfair, unjust, and unconscionable. And that is why we've seen the changes in the law that have taken place, which also shows that the process of evolution of law is not something static. It is not frozen in time. It will evolve. And the discourse that we have, the discourse of public life, the discourse of everyday life will have an impact and a bearing on how the law evolves. The Academy is indeed delighted that this first Justice Katikala Memorial Lecture will be delivered by one of the brightest stars on the legal firmament, learned Attorney General K.K. Venugopal, who personally knew late Justice Katikala and was present when the Supreme Court made its references to Justice Katikala. And today is the second anniversary, because last time, because of COVID and other things, it could not be organized. So I'm very happy that this has happened, because today we are talking We're talking about memorial lectures. Why are they organized? And while researching on this, I found that there is an infinite number of material that's available on public lectures. Now, the fact is that there has always been a tradition of discussion and discourse, both in the Indic civilizations and in the Occident. I mean, we've had Dharma Shastras, gurus talking about traveling around at Kumbh Melas and various other places, but the discussion has been on the scriptural or on the spiritual aspects of this. But what is important is that increasingly we have to understand how this tradition came about, because while this tradition has always been there in India, in Europe, till the Renaissance, until Martin Luther King brought this out in the public fold, knowledge was itself restricted. So the public lecture or a memorial lecture is actually an exposition when you take knowledge out of the confines of a particular class or a particular community or a particular religious denomination and spread it out, make it public. In fact, some of the first public lectures were also crowd-funded, like Thomas Carlyle's lectures on great lives. These are publicly funded. But over a period of time, several institutions and several endowments have established memorial lectures which not only recognize the legacy of the person on whom they have been named, also talk about a contemporary theme about which the public needs to know and which the public needs to engage in a discourse with. And therefore, the choice of the person on whom the lecture is named, the choice of the speaker, and the choice of the subject all have a great bearing and a great relevance on how the discourse moves on. And it's in this context that we must understand and realize that, earlier, everybody thought that the best way to honor a person would be to have a road after that person, or to have a building after the person, or to have something after the person. But remember that whenever you have names on public roads, those names get abbreviated. So, and then after they are abbreviated, they also lose out in public memory. A public memorial lecture, therefore, is very significant because it focuses attention on the person, persona, and thoughts of the person on whom the lecture is being organized. The person who is invited to give the lecture, it's an acknowledgement for him. The lead discussant who comes, it's an acknowledgement of his work and his scholarship on the subject, and all those who participate and attend. Even if some part of the discourse remains and some thoughts remain, it will lead to a further dialogic process. After all, democracy is all about dialogues. Democracy is all about communication. Democracy is all about discussion, and it's all about connecting various thoughts and getting people together. In fact, as far as India is concerned, I would like to share with you that the tradition of modern public speaking, that is public speaking, which is purely secular. I mean, there has been a lot of, Shankar spoke, Buddha spoke. We've had a lot of spiritual discourses in the country. But as far as the secular or the public administration discourse in the country is concerned, this started with the formation of the Indian National Congress, and stalwarts like Sir Surendranath Banerjee, a member of the ICS, was the person who first went on a whirlwind all-India tour on the subject of opening the ICS and holding simultaneous exams both in England and in India. And therefore, Surendranath Banerjee is one of those recognizable persons who spoke on the subject in public lectures, not only in Kolkata, that is where he was from, but he spoke at Lahore, he spoke at Allahabad, he spoke at Pune, he spoke at Cuttack, and at various places. And that is how the discourse, a public lecture also leads to a discourse. And therefore, great public lectures also lead to our minds, evolving with time and thinking about how we can get things organized on a better manner. The first editorials in Tribune on holding simultaneous examinations for the ICS and in the Bengali, they are all a result of the lectures of Sir Surendranath Banerjee. In fact, sometimes, as in the case of Dr. Ambedkar, he was invited for a public lecture to Lahore. And when they saw the printed speech, they withdrew the invitation. Therefore, the public lectures are also areas where a lot of discourse happens. And in fact, one of the most seminal works of Ambedkar, Annihilation of Caste, drew from a lecture which he was invited to give in Lahore, but could not deliver because such was the opposition to that lecture. So it's a very interesting take on this subject. When you look at the website today of the memorial lectures, in India, you find that we have the Patel Memorial Lecture, we have which is organized by the External Affairs Ministry, we have the J.N. Tata Memorial Lecture, which is organized by the Institute of Science, we have the Visvesvaraya Memorial Lecture, which is organized in Mysore, the Nehru Lecture, which is organized by the Nehru Fund in association with the University of Cambridge, the C.D. Deshmukh lecture, which is organized by the Indian National Center, and so many. In fact, if you search and Google the public lectures, you can get a lot of material on that. And therefore, there is a wide acceptance of the fact that the way to honor and acknowledge a public intellectual is through a public lecture. And that's what we are doing today. And I'm so glad that Srinivas chose his alma mater to be the place to organize this lecture. This could have been organized anywhere. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Now I must mention one more thing. The Academy does two roles. And those two roles are complementary, but not exactly parallel to each other. You see, we are a knowledge organization, but we are also a training institution. And the role of knowledge and the role of training are connected, but also distinct. Training is for here and now. Training is to help you do your job better. It is about your roles and responsibilities tomorrow and perhaps day after. Knowledge is different. Knowledge is not for tomorrow. Knowledge organizations also have to think about what happens in the very, very long run. And therefore, the Academy has both the role to train you as SDMs and DMs and as directors. But the Academy also has a role as a knowledge organization to make you think ahead, to make you think beyond the immediate. Because thinking beyond the immediate is also the domain of the Indian Civil Service. But if we don't do it, who else will? So together, the Academy has both these roles, and therefore, the Academy also we organize the P. Srinivas Memorial Lecture. This lecture is organized in honor of a very brave forest officer who laid down his life trying to save sandalwood in Karnataka. The name of the person who killed him is well known, I will not repeat it because I do not want to give credence to that person. I want to give credence to P. Srinivas because he is the one person who fought and died for saving the forest and the environment. These lectures for the last 25 years have been given by very distinguished personalities. We've had Padma Bhushan, Chandi Prasad Bhatt talk on the subject. We've had Mr. Ramchandra Guha also talk on him. We've had Sunita Narayan talk about him. And when they talk about him, they will talk about him in the first paragraph. But in the next paragraphs, they will talk about the Chipko movement. They will talk about how Chipko started in Gopeshwar and became a movement which changed the dynamic and changed the discourse of forest policy in the country. When Sunita Narayan talks to us on the P. Srinivas Memorial Lecture, she's not talking about P. Srinivas alone. She's talking about how do you handle ecology? How do you handle waste? How do you handle urban management? What is the concept of the solar? What is the connections thereof? So that is what a public lecture does. So public lecture is not just a building. A public lecture sets the discourse. And so we are very happy that we will be adding this lecture also to the series of discourses that we've been having on P. Srinivas. The Academy also was the host and the venue to the memorial lecture on Mr. P.S. Krishnan, which we organized with the Center for Dalit Studies. Now, going through and most of you have heard this lecture, but the important point is not just to recall what P.S. Krishnan did for those who are not as entitled as you and I are, but to make us think on what will be our role in ensuring that this gets furthered, in ensuring that what is a matter of right is treated as a matter of right and not as a matter of grace. So that is another point which happened, and we are soon signing up with the Ministry of Social Justice for that. So I'm very glad that this third lecture which is going to be here is on another subject which will largely be on the interface of the judiciary and the executive. So we will have three important knowledge lectures in this academy. One relating to forest ecology and environment, the second relating to social inclusion, and the third about governance, administrative action, and judicial review. So in the fitness of things, it's very good that the choice of lectures that we have in this academy, the choice of speakers that we have will certainly, and most certainly help us to look further ahead and think, because what we think today, how we think today is going to determine the shape of future in this country. The subject that's going to be discussed today is administrative discretion and judicial review, a subject which is so close to our hearts because as administrators, our job is to act in the best and bona fide interests of what we think is right. Naturally in the performance of our duties, and because there is a bias for action, yoga sarvasya kaushalam, we have to be defined not by what we think but by what we do. There is bound to be areas of gray, there are bound to be areas which we will point out and mention, but act we must. And therefore when we will act, we will exercise discretion. Sometimes this discretion may not be appropriate. Sometimes it will be called for judicial review. But when administrative discretion and judicial review go together, we will be charting a new course and a better course for the administration and governance of this country. So with these few words, let me again thank Srinivas for giving us this endowment lecture. And not only that, he's also giving us a prize, and that's for the of all those who do the best assignments in law in FC, Phase 1, district training, and Phase 2 will also be receiving the Justice Katikala Memorial Award of 10,000 rupees. So we thank Srinivas for having, and I look forward to seeing one of the younger officers getting this award. We're very grateful to you, Attorney General Sir, for having accepted our invite. I know it is very difficult for you to spare time, but because of your personal association and your regard for Justice Katikala, you have agreed to come to us online. And of course, no words to thank you, sir, Mr. Chamanlalji. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Your words were an enlightenment. Now I invite respected Shri Chaman Lal ji to speak on this.
Respected Mr. Venugopal, Attorney General, Director Mr. Sanjeev Chopra, Mr. Srinivas, members of the faculty and officers of Phase 1 and Phase 3 courses. The Academy under the leadership of Mr. Chopra is doing a great service by honoring the memory of Justice Ramaswamy, an exceptionally decent human being and a great jurist. I had the privilege of working very closely with him in the National Human Rights Commission for nearly 4 years. And together with me was Mr. K.R. Venugopal, a member of your community, a retired IAS officer who retired as the secretary to Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. Mr. Venugopal wanted me to mention here that Justice Ramaswamy had dedicated his entire life to the emancipation of the marginalized. He worked for the poor, and he has immense reputation for his revolutionary pro-poor judgments like Samta, leading to land alienation. I will just mention 2-3 instances in the NHRC where I learned from him the power of righteous indignation. We used to review bonded labor situation in various states, and the way he used to handle these meetings and speak to the chief secretary and others about their obligations and about the disregard of their duties showed me how powerful this righteous indignation can be. I remember we were reviewing the situation in Chandigarh when the Chief Minister of Haryana said, "Sir, you'll be happy to know we have no bonded labor in Haryana now." And Justice Ramaswamy simply says, "How can I believe you? There are so many brick kilns in Haryana. No brick kiln can function without bonded labor. And all these brick kilns are owned by your MPs and MLAs." The gentleman was speechless after hearing this. But the high point of his stay in the NHRC was the conference, international conference at Durban, the Conference Against Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and other forms of tolerance, when he handled a very sensitive subject, and that was whether the caste in Indian context is included in the word racial there. And the government of India even had a different perception. But the way Justice Ramaswamy handled this, he said it doesn't matter whether caste is taken as a part of racial discrimination or not. But the fact that in our country, people are graded on the basis of their birth. And this atrocity, this discrimination is rooted in the birth. And the persistence of this shows that we cannot claim to be a polity governed by rule of law until we remove it. This was a very courageous statement. And when it came out, all the NGOs and other activists, they went into ecstasy. They lifted him up. Everybody wanted to touch him to see the heart, feel the touch of a man who was so competent, who was so courageous. This is what I learned from him. And I found that he was simple in his dressing, simple in his eating, simple, but accomplished lawyer and a person to live. I'll just mention 1 or 2 points about the subject because a very eminent legal luminary explained. But the significance of judicial review and administrative tribunal is becoming all the more relevant now because your job is becoming more complex, hazardous, risky. People are now conscious of their rights and they feel that they have a right to demand from you what you are going to deliver and how you are going to deliver it. And judicial review, which earlier had a simple meaning of sitting in judgment over the decision, now it has very dimensions. And the one thing that Gujarat case had brought light that the judiciary can not only question us about how we do our mandatory duties, but also for acts of inaction. If inaction on our part is leading to any situation or abuse of power, that becomes a legitimate concern of the judiciary. Then the administrative discretion, which is there, as Mr. Chopra also said, to ensure that we act, because I also feel that we have no option but to perform. And I would add, we have no option but to succeed. But when we use this discretion, which is beyond the mandated rules and regulations, we have to keep in mind that this is in furtherance of the objective for which it has been conferred and not against that. Because we can use discretion to help. We can use discretion to harm also, but how we act, because discretion allows us subjective exercise of subjective preferences. It leads to arbitrariness. It can lead to abuse of power. So it has to be very carefully. It's not a license, it is a judgment that has to be arrived at very, very carefully after a lot of deliberation. But the judicial review and the administration, which we'll be discussing if you find time further, are very important themes. And I congratulate the Academy and Mr. Venugopal for having taken up this particular theme, which will certainly be useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom. Now I'll request learned Attorney General of India, respected Shri K.K. Venugopal ji, to deliver the memorial lecture.
Dr. Sanjeev Chopra, Director of the Academy. I hope I'm being heard.
Yes, sir, you are.
I'm heard. Shri Chamanlal, Shri Srinivas Ramaswamy Katikala, and young ladies and gentlemen. See, I'm especially happy to deliver this particular lecture in memory of the late Justice K. Ramaswamy, because I had an excellent relationship with Justice Ramaswamy, both on the bench and off the bench. He was a greatly admired judge, and there is a fact which many do not know, that he had delivered the largest number of judgments, reported ones, which are precedents, by any judge in the Supreme Court up till today. The figure is 2,227 judgments. He was a voracious reader and a voracious writer also. And outside court, he used to call me by my first name, Venu. And I was very happy because we are friends outside court. Whenever a function was organized by the bar or by the judges of the Supreme Court, and when we met at that time, he was a philanthropist. He had a deep commitment to the cause of rural development. And he invested himself in developing his native village as a model village with facilities and services. He even established a hospital, an elementary school, a library building, and a community hall. I'd like to ask myself the question, which among the judges, both of the Supreme Court and the High Court, after retirement, has done so much for the people around him. And that's why I admire the late Justice Ramaswamy to a tremendous extent. Now, I find that all of you, young men and women, would have studied the Constitution of India, which is one of the subjects which you have to write for the civil services examination. And therefore, you'll be in a position to appreciate whatever I would be telling you now. And having a background in the Constitution of India, you would well know that we have adopted the Westminster system of government, or what is called the cabinet system of parliamentary government. We are a common law country, just as in the case of England, and as well as in the United States. And when you say the Westminster system of government, it means that there is a division of powers between the three great organs of state that is resulting from the separation of powers. The legislatures, both of the state and of parliament, exercise legislative powers, lawmaking powers. Judiciary exercises judicial powers, and the executive would exercise executive powers. But this is not a hidebound separation. You would find that each one exercises a certain amount of, for example, Parliament exercises judicial powers. When it holds somebody up for contempt of Parliament or of the legislature of a state, when the legislature of a state calls upon somebody to saying that you have breached our privilege. Now, they have to then act as judges. In regard to the defections, the anti-defection law gives the power of judicial adjudication as to whether it is defection or not to the Speaker. Similarly, the executive has a vast amount of quasi-judicial powers, not pure judicial powers, when it decides upon the various facets of governance which is entrusted to the superior executive. Now, this would extend to, say, grant of licenses, quotas, grant of contracts, mining leases, and a variety of other functions. Now, how do you exercise these powers? You have a discretion, but not absolute in terms. A discretion which is contained, which has to be exercised within the parameters of the authority given to you. The statute, when it says that you may give a license for, say, grant of a motor vehicle permit for plying motor vehicles, it sets out the objective criteria on the basis of which you would grant that permit. There should be a route, there should be the necessity of the public for travel from one point to the other point, and if there is a competition, there should be a method by which you select one among the applicants. This is where a vast amount of discretion arises. Therefore, you would exercise what is known as subjective satisfaction, but based on objective criteria. Now, here is where judicial review comes in. Now, I had appeared in my early years in a number of motor vehicle cases which used to come up to the Supreme Court because the licenses and permits were very valuable. And there you would find that the judges would go into it by way of judicial review, applying the rules, which would be based on whatever applies to the exercise of powers under administrative law. And therefore, I now come to the principles which really curtail the discussion. And it's very important that anybody, any officer who exercises these powers should realize that he has limitations. Now, the very first limitation is if you are deciding a matter which relates to the rights of a person, where a selection has to be made between parties, applicants, you have to follow the principles of natural justice. This is fundamental, and I have no doubt whatsoever that all of you are well aware of this. And natural justice means a hearing. But a mere hearing is not enough. You have to provide that party with whatever is the material which you are using. You are taking disciplinary action against an officer, against a subordinate officer. In which case, whatever is the material that relating to the charge against him, you have to give it to him. And thereafter a hearing, and thereafter a decision, And perhaps before the punishment is effected, you would hear him again as to what is the extent of the punishment that you would levy, and you would put it to him, and he would have to say, look, I have done such human service to the government. You are now proceeding against me, and you are wanting to dismiss me from service. And then these are the problems which I will face. I have a family, that, this, and everything else. But this means that one of the basic fundamentals of the rule of law is that you have to follow the principles of natural justice. But do not proceed on the basis that natural justice only means a hearing and giving him the material and passing an order. You have to give the reasons. In your order, you will have to say as to why exactly is it that you have selected A and rejected B. And there have to be sound reasons. Now, there is a statute under which you function. That statutes will tell you what are the objects for which the statute has been passed. Therefore, anything that you do will have to keep in mind, you will have to keep in mind the objects and pass an order which is reasoned, dealing with each one of the aspects which have arisen, each one of the objections raised, each one of the arguments. And for that, you will have to have skill. You will have to be able to decide as to what will be the important issues which have been raised and put them one by one clearly as 1, 2, 3, 4, and then give your decision against each one of them. Reasons are very necessary. And in the beginning, it had been held that reasons were not part of natural justice, but subsequently the law has evolved and it has been held that reasons are essential. And if you don't give the reasons, your order will be set aside, matter will be sent back to you. You will have to then again go through the whole rigmarole of a hearing and give the reasons. Now, there is an aspect of natural justice which is known as the rule against bias. No person can be a judge in his own cause. And therefore, if you are biased in any manner, if there is a factor in the case which affects your independence in regard to that decision making, then in such a case, you have to recuse yourself. Now, we have any number of cases. In the beginning, administrative law decision making was dealt with separately from quasi-judicial decision making. But a leading case known as Kripak versus Union of India, delivered in 1969, Justice Hegde said that the dividing line between administrative decision making and judicial, quasi-judicial decision making is now become thinner and thinner and is disappearing. Today we treat all these sort of decisions where you have to decide the issue based on certain objective factors, the rules which have been laid down by the statute or by the subordinate legislation, and you have to take a decision, compare between the competition between two parties as to why are you preferring one against the other. All this will fall in the realm of quasi-judicial decision making. Now, this being so, the difference having disappeared, we have the leading case of Kripak, which was where an Inspector General of Forests was on the selection committee of candidates who were other inspectors general and lower than that, for the purpose of being inducted into the All India Forest Service. Now, this gentleman sat, looked into the confidential records, ACRs of all the parties, questioned them, and then came his turn. And therefore, his ACR was to be looked into. And therefore, he said, I recuse myself. And therefore, he got up and went away. And some other person sat in his place. And thereafter, he was selected and promoted to the All India Forest Service. The Supreme Court was shocked. The Supreme Court said this can't be done because you would have eliminated all the competition one by one by influencing the thinking of the other members of the selection committee. And therefore, so far as this is concerned, it is not permissible. And therefore, they set aside his appointment to the All India Service. Now, there is another aspect that even a pound or even a cent of pecuniary interest in a case would disqualify the person. And we have the case of Dimes versus Grand Junction Canal. That is an 1852 case, and a strictness with which they apply this question of bias, because there could be pecuniary bias. It was a case where the law lord who decided the matter, one among them, the Lord Chancellor who presided, had shares in the Grand Junction Canal. And when the matter came up before another court, the Lord Campbell stated, no one can suppose that Lord Kotana, who had that interest, could be in the remotest degree influenced by his interests that he had in the company. But it is of greatest importance that the maximum that no man can be a judge in his own cause should be held sacred. And that is not to be confined to a cause in which he is a party. It applies to a cause in which he has an interest. And therefore, they said, even the least amount of interest, pecuniary interest, because he held shares, would disqualify him. And the judgment in Dimes was set aside. There was another more interesting case, and this was the Pinochet case. The deportation of General Pinochet, who was in England, came up before the House of Lords. And the House of Lords ruled against Pinochet and said that he does not enjoy immunity from arrest as a former president of the Republic of Chile. And therefore, he could be deported. Extradition would be allowed. But at that hearing, one of the judges was Lord Hoffman. And Lord Hoffman was the director and chairperson of Amnesty International Charity Limited. And Amnesty International had intervened in this very case to argue against Pinochet. And therefore, the court held that so far as Lord Hoffman was concerned, though Lord Hoffman denied and said, look, I had no prejudice against Pinochet, and therefore the decision to extradite him was taken fairly. But nevertheless, the House of Lords set aside the judgment and said this has to be re-argued before a bench in which Lord Hoffman is not there. Now, when you, as a member of the All India Service, is entrusted with the question of granting contracts, etc., and so on, if you are connected to any one of the applicants, the proper thing to do is to straightaway say that I will not continue in this case. I will recuse myself. I will not continue for the question of selection. Now, this happens in the Supreme Court even. But the Supreme Court, the history is slightly different. Now, in very big corporates come before the Supreme Court as litigants. Some of them are some of the biggest in the country, 1, 2, 3, 4, so far as their level is concerned. And many of the judges would have shares because the shares are very valuable and they would appreciate. And when the case comes up before the judge, sitting in a bench of 3 or so, one judge stands up and tells the lawyers, look, I should tell you before I start the case, I have shares in this company. Now, if anybody has any objection, please tell us. In which case I will recuse myself. Now, this I think is not correct. It's slightly improper for the reason that it places the lawyers in a very embarrassing position. Because the lawyer has to say, my lord, I don't have confidence in your lordship now that you have shares. Therefore, please recuse. No lawyer wants to say that. Therefore, it is not appropriate that the judge should tell the bar, look, if you have no confidence, tell me because I have shares and I will recuse myself. He should never do that. Before the case comes up before him and he sees the brief, he sees that he has shares, straight away he should say, I will not hear this case. Let it go before some other bench. And that is what should be done. But Hoffman didn't recuse himself. And Dimes, the judge concerned, House of Lords judge, did not recuse himself. And therefore, the Supreme Court judge may ask himself that. But this is my personal opinion. Don't place the members of the bar who are appearing before you in a rather embarrassing situation where you have to tell the judge, I don't want you to continue in this case. Please recuse yourself. Now comes the question about grant of contracts, etc. Now, this is being freely done by way of nomination. In the good old days, in the 50s and so on, you would say the Tendu leaves contract in Jammu and Kashmir. Very well, I select this man. And because he's done it last year, I give it to him. Now, all that was thrown about by the judgment in 1979 of Ramanna Dayaram Shetty versus the International Airport, where the Supreme Court said that today there's a tremendous expansion of welfare and social service functions. And we are living in a welfare state. That's what the preamble to the Constitution itself says. And therefore, there's a tremendous increase in the material resources of the country, and there is a large-scale industrial and commercial activities which are going on. All this would require the state to intervene under the various provisions of the statutes which govern the grant of the permits or contracts. And therefore came the rule that it is unthinkable that in a democracy governed by the rule of law, the executive government or any of its officers should possess arbitrary power over the interests of the individual. Every action of the executive, mind you, must be informed with reason and should be free from arbitrariness. That is a very essence of the rule of law, and it's bare minimal requirement. And as a result of which, that court held that the government pours forth wealth, money, benefits, services, contracts, quotas and licenses. And these are in the nature of largesse. A person who gets, say, a mining lease, who gets a contract for the purpose of supply of goods and services, his future is made so far as economically, he is on velvet. Now, this is called largesse. Can you therefore go about distributing it freely? You are a collector of a district, you are the secretary of the government of India or the government of a state, and the power is vested in you by a statute for the purpose of the decision making. It is held that the power of giving licenses means the power to withhold them. And that gives control to the agents of government, that is the members of the All India Services and so on, to decide as to whether you should give that or not as by way of largesse. And therefore, there will be restrictions on your power. And that was what was held in Royappa versus the state of Tamil Nadu. Royappa was a chief secretary. And so far as the chief secretary is concerned, he was removed because the then chief minister, I forget the name of the chief minister, and the chief minister was a very powerful man. He wanted a chief secretary who would fall in line. Royappa was very independent. Therefore, he removed him. And the court, of course, pontificated The court said, look, equality and arbitrariness are sworn enemies. One belongs to the rule of law in a republic, while the other to the whim and caprice of an absolute monarch. Where an act is arbitrary, it is implicit in it that it is unequal, both according to political logic and constitutional law, and is therefore violative of Article 14. And this was a landmark judgment where the court introduced into Article 14, which said don't discriminate between two groups. But it said also, inbuilt into Article 14 is the rule against arbitrariness. Equality is the antithesis of arbitrariness. Therefore, any order passed which you are able to show is arbitrary in nature, taking note of the statute under which you are exercising the power, that would be liable to be set aside. And thereafter, so far as the lawyers are concerned, they made hay out of this judgment, where it was easy for them to go into any order which is passed by an executive officer and then find it hidden in between the lines what they would believe is arbitrariness. And then came the further restrictions in what is called as the Wensbury principle, that is Associated Picture House versus Wensbury in 1948. That is, they said, if a decision of a quasi-judicial decision is based on wholly irrelevant material or irrelevant considerations, it is ignorant, a very relevant material which it should have taken into consideration, or it is so absurd that no sensible person could ever have reached it, then in such a case, that decision will have to be set aside. The question was asked, what is meant by unreasonableness? And the court said, suppose you wanted to promote a person, a nurse, to a higher position, and you said, that nurse is red-haired. I am not prepared to put in the higher position a nurse with red hair, and therefore I reject her. Now, ex facie, I think all of us would agree that this is something which is wholly arbitrary, an extraordinary approach, and therefore this is what is called arbitrariness, and therefore unreasonable. And therefore you would set aside that order, disqualifying that nurse from being considered merely because she had red hair. And the last of this, which I would, because my time is getting up, that last of this is mala fides. Any number of cases of mala fides have been found. You should proceed on the basis that, I don't know whether I'm justified in saying that a few among the political persons in authority, ministers and all that, when they have these powers, they are likely to decide in favor of their own political party and give it to one among them or their own relatives and so on. Now, one of the leading cases was that of the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, no less than Sanjeev Reddy. Now, Sanjeev Reddy was compelled to nationalize motor vehicles. Now, nationalization would hit his political constituency very badly because I don't know whether all of you know, motor vehicles at one time was financially and economically at the top level in earning monies, and they would freely get laws passed by funding the government and contributing to the election fund and so on. Therefore, district by district, 25 districts or so, had to be nationalized one by one after the other. Now, the Chief Minister, Sanjeev Reddy's district, in which was his constituency, was number 3 or so. While what he did was, he altered the order and brought it right to the bottom so that it would be nationalized after 3 years, which is because of the long drawn-out process. This was challenged. And the court said this is mala fide because you are exercising the power for an extraneous purpose, for your own political future. And therefore, so far as this is concerned, if a power is exercised with extraneous motives to achieve an extraneous end or an illegitimate end, that would be mala fides. They struck it down. And of course, this did not affect Sanjeeva Reddy because he finally became the President of India. Though when he selected Charan Singh, who had no following, to be the caretaker Prime Minister when Morarjibai's government had fallen, where he was highly criticized because Charan Singh was not even prepared to face Parliament to prove his confidence, the confidence that Parliament would have in him. Now, this is one among the factors. Therefore, please don't proceed on the basis that you have absolute discretion. Now, they say that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, therefore, please be careful. You are the servants of the people. And therefore, you will have to have that in mind whenever you exercise any of your powers, that you are for the doing good to the country, and that comes first. And the people of the country are the ones whom you have to serve. You are the backbone really of the country, and I am sure all of you have a great future, and I'm happy that I've been given this opportunity to address all of you on the eve of your taking off into the world of administrative law. Thank you.
Thank you, Venugopal sir, for your words of wisdom, which will come a long way in improving administrative efficiency. Now, may I request respected Shri Chaman Lal ji to give brief comments on the issue.
Well, we have had a scholarly address from the great legal luminary Mr. Venugopal. He has dealt with largely about what concerns you directly, that is the discretion. And he has made one thing very clear, that this discretion must be exercised to further the objective for which this power has been conferred. And then referring to the principles of natural justice, he has clearly explained that no one is to be condemned without hearing, no one is to be a judge in his opinion. But the most important thing, which most of us miss, an order that is a reasoned order, where everything is. Somehow or other, we all, from administration, etc., feel it below dignity to explain to the person why we have rejected his case. As Mr. Venugopal clearly says, that we should never forget that we are public servants. And as a matter of fact, public service is a vocation. It's not a business enterprise. And when we are dealing with issues concerning people, these are rights issues. We are doing no favor. We are simply trying to give them what legitimately belongs to them and has been denied to them. But administrative discretion, he has dealt with in detail, but I would like to submit that as regards the judiciary, for example, here, he said that no one should be a judge in his own case. And we have a case where a Chief Justice of India, former, he became a judge in his own case. And we cannot hide this kind of thing because it affects our judgment. Then there's a popular perception that the Supreme Court, which has, as he explained, very clearly well-defined area of working through separation of powers, but Supreme Court, in disregard of that, is giving the impression, not giving the impression, is entering into the areas of executive and legislator. For example, orders on monkey menace, ragging, etc. And this is at the cost of a lot of matter where the Supreme Court has to function as an arbiter or as a settler of constitution, as a sentinel of our fundamental rights and a guardian of constitution. All those cases, whether it is 370 or it is electoral bond or whether it is a Citizen Amendment Act, that goes into the background. And this impression that they are playing to gallery, that's not good for the health of the drama. That they are usurpation of the powers of executive and legislator they are doing, this is not good for the health of the democracy should do it. Then, in judicial matters, for example, discussion, I would like to submit with his permission that the vast area of discussion is in criminal justice system, which is your responsibility, direct responsibility, because it concerns the Act. And this is an area which has discretion at all stages, whether it is FIR, whether it is arrest, whether it is challan, who to spare, who to pursue, etc. It is there. And all the discipline that he has adopted must apply, because this determines the quality of criminal justice system, determines our ranking as a civilized nation. And that's why this is the most important area where the discretion, whatever we have, has to be exercised. This would all depend upon the realization of what he said, our status as public servant and our service as a public calling, because these concepts, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, these have moral connotation. And if we accept the obligation to uphold these and follow the principle that public work that we are doing is devoted to public service, only then we can exercise our discretion properly and we can ensure that but I would say by saying that the discretion ultimately is to act as a facilitator and enabler. It is to help you in doing, as Mr. Chopra said, what you have to do under our circumstances. And that is where this can work. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Academy, worthy director, sir, the course team, the faculty, fellow officer trainees, colleagues, we are indeed grateful to respected learned Attorney General of India, Shri K.K. Venugopal ji, who despite occupying such a high constitutional position and busy schedule, found out time for us. Sir, with your years of experience and your words of wisdom, I'm sure they'll reverberate in our consciousness and will come a long way in improving our functioning and also to differentiate administrative discretion and judicial review. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, then, thank you. Okay.